is with great pleasure that I introduce our next keynote speaker, Priya Satia. I've had the wonderful opportunity of being, I've been in California, I've been in Stanford this year, where Priya is the Raymond Spruance Professor of International History, has made a tremendous name for herself in British history and the history of British Empire more generally, as just a leading voice about questions of the sort of a broad set of questions about the history of the British Empire. It says on her bio that she's a cultural historian. I would expand that quite a bit. Not that there's anything wrong with being a cultural historian, but I discovered your work in what was really an article that she sent to the journal Les Annales that focused on what she referred to as the sideshow, or no longer the sideshow, the Middle East during the First World War. And as I hope the last two panels have served to highlight, is that if you start examining the peace treaty, not thinking of making the world from Paris, but that Paris is interacting with a whole set of dynamics that have their own logics, that have their own alternative conceptions, their own genealogies, and that there is a true dynamic taking place there. We are forced to think about the treaty in fundamentally different ways, and Priya's article there did that. Her first book, entitled Spies in Arabia, I can't recommend enough if you are interested in these questions. Spies in Arabia, the Great War and the Cultural Foundations of Britain's covert covert empire in the Middle East. So it's the sort of origin of these spies. It is a fantastic work. And then she has recently published another book entitled Empire of Guns, The Violent Making of the Industrial Revolution, which she published with Penguin, which is just a fantastic book as well. So Priya is here to speak to us with her talk entitled The Unsettling Settlement, 1919 in the Middle East. Please join me in welcoming her to this podium.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Thank you so much for that introduction, Steve, and thank you for inviting me here, and thanks to AUP for all the wonderful arrangements. I know it's been a long day, and let's try it. It's a long day of listening to talks that have been eminently fascinating, but it gets to a point at 5 o'clock, and it kind of makes you wonder, if we're talking about conferences and bad decisions, how many bad decisions at Versailles were made because it was 5 o'clock and people were tired, as we reenact over these 3 days. Anyway, hopefully, I'll speak for about 40 minutes, and I hope we'll have some time for questions afterwards, and then we can continue talking during the cocktail. So as we all know, World War I was a world war, but our memory of it is really closely tied to images of France and the Western Front. And that's understandable given the enormous toll of life there and the sort of immense cultural production from that front. But that focus also betrays a kind of parochialism that dates from 1914 itself, when other theaters of the war, at least in the sort of British telling of it, were termed sideshows, despite their often enormous scale and impact. And occasionally, the strangeness or the injustice of this was registered, even in Britain. So, for instance, one headline in the London Times in September 1915 demanded, "Why is the Persian Gulf campaign ignored?" And the answer was that the marginalization of that campaign in the news had been made necessary by the ethical dubiousness of British actions in that theater. In fact, British activity in the Middle East was particularly shrouded in secrecy from the start of the war. And this was because the British were concerned that their reliance on Indian Army troops in their fight against the Ottoman Empire, risked alienating the opinion of Indian Muslims, because the Ottoman Empire was also the seat of the caliphate, right? The Sultan is also the caliph, the Sunni caliph. And so a lot of Indian Muslims feel an allegiance towards him. So the British geopolitical ambitions in the region also made them concerned about criticism from anti-imperialists at home and around the world, the fact that they had these kind of secret ambitions to expand into the Middle East. So let's revisit this marginalized story now to see how it might change our understanding of the importance of the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. And as a reminder, I am a historian of Britain and the British Empire. I'm not a historian of the Middle East. Fortunately, we just had the chance to hear from three real historians of the Middle East. So I'm going to focus on the action in the Middle East out of a conviction partly that this too is European history. Certainly a historian of the Middle East would focus on the story in a different way, as the last panel did, but European history was also made abroad, and so we're going to go looking for it there now. So now the British stationed Indian Army troops, as I mentioned, at the start of the war in the Persian Gulf with the idea of defending British interests in the region. So I have a pointer here. So basically, right there is where they station troops because the Anglo-Persian Oil Company is there. So their concern is to secure that. But as they're positioned there, they get very ambitious and start to push north towards Baghdad. Now, the British referred to this campaign as the Mesopotamia Campaign, and it afterwards became the region that makes up roughly present-day Iraq. Now, further west, so this is just to give you a sense of the campaign. Sorry, I'm a little behind on my slides here. So this is just a summary of the troop movements from here up towards Baghdad, and then they wind up at the end at Mosul. This is the campaign further west, known as the Palestine Campaign. So troops, again, are positioned ostensibly defensively at the Suez Canal, which is here, because that's a major thoroughfare connecting the British Empire, connecting the British to the jewel of the empire in India. But the troops there guarding the canal embark on an offensive north into Palestine and Syria, winding up at Damascus. And they're coordinating with a British-backed Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire that's led by the rulers of the Hejaz, which is, so this is the Arab army that's fighting in the Arab revolt with their flag. And this is just to give you a sense of the Hejaz. It's the area around the Red Sea. That's where the holy cities of Mecca and Medina are. And the rulers of the Hejaz are known as the Sharifians in sort of diplomatic parlance. Now, there are early failures in this campaign that sort of tend to reinforce this early inclination the British had to keep things about these campaigns secret. And we can talk more about what the failures were if you're interested in the Q&A. In any case, by 1917, the tide had sort of turned. And there was a lot of good news coming out of the Middle East. And after these British successes against the Ottoman Empire, secrecy is replaced by a kind of belated propaganda effort to make sure the British public knows about these very rare successes during this war. So good news from the Middle East starts to prove crucial to sustaining British morale during the war and keeping Britons invested in the war as things are continuing to go badly wrong on the Western Front. I think this is really important and often overlooked. Now, the fall of Baghdad in the fall of 1917 was really important. This was a city that evoked magical associations for Britons for generations that had been raised on the stories of the Arabian Nights. And it was hailed as, quote, the most triumphant piece of strategy since the war started. And here's a picture of General Maud marching into Baghdad in October 1917. And this triumph convinced the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, to make Jerusalem a, quote, Christmas gift to his people, just when the Battle of Passchendaele was ending in failure. And so in a sense, the Palestine campaign was staged by the British government as practically a propaganda exercise to enhance morale at a real low point in the war. So Lloyd George christened the Palestine campaign the Last Crusade, and it gave it that sort of romance and glamour. And indeed, Jerusalem did fall in December 1917, and this incited public euphoria in Britain. The bell of Westminster chimed for the first time in 3 years. Now, the glamour around these campaigns also helped bring the United States into the war and thus actually bring the war to an end. At official prompting, the journalist Lowell Thomas was sent to the tent of T.E. Lawrence in the desert. And Lawrence was, of course, the main advisor, sort of the head advisor to the British-backed Arab revolt. And Lowell Thomas's job was to go there, find a hero in this war that had no heroes otherwise. And the point of this was to come up with a story that would rouse the militarism of the United States. And so there's also a poster up here from the stage show that he assembled based on his time with Lawrence. And this was sort of the launching of the Lawrence of Arabia legend. Now, the campaign's successes also helped sustain British faith in the reigning military science. After trench warfare, the troops in Mesopotamia successfully pushed north once they had been supplied with the right technological infrastructure. And here's just a picture of some Indian troops laying telephone wire over the desert to improve communications in that theater. This was interpreted as proof that trench warfare could yield to mobile action. The campaigns were also the sites of tactical innovation unseen on the Western Front. It was in the Middle East campaigns that modern deception tactics, covert operations, and air power were developed, and we can again talk about this later if you want. And the British felt uniquely licensed to experiment with these new techniques that were, they would consider tactics of intrigue, dishonorable in some way, but they felt comfortable pursuing them in this region because they thought of it as a region that was essentially deceptive in its nature, right? It's the Orient, it's the inscrutable East. They also imagined the desert as particularly suited to air power, and we can talk about that as well later. I'm deferring some of these wartime topics to focus on 1919. Now, after the war, these innovations in military strategy and tactics were acknowledged as a source of lessons for future warfare. Post-war military journals in Britain noted a, quote, reversal in the importance of the various campaigns, with Mesopotamia and Palestine seizing attention. As a result of the government's propaganda efforts, by the end of the war, many Britons had come to pin their hopes for cultural, political, and economic redemption on the Middle East. So Mesopotamia was, of course, the cradle of civilization. And the idea was that by restoring this cradle of civilization, they might redeem the wartime crumbling of civilization and prove again the power of the European civilizing mission. The object of the Mesopotamia campaign was, they said, a, quote, regenerated Babylonia where traffickers from all the earth once more meet. Mesopotamia would supply cotton and wheat. It would supply fields for European industry. It would, quote, enlarge the wealth of a universe wasted by war. These were the words of the prominent British administrator in Iraq, Gertrude Bell, who's pictured here. Likewise, the final crusade in Palestine, officials were saying, would bring peace and freedom to the Holy Land and make it, quote, all seem worthwhile. So, of course, there are many ironies associated with these hopes. Now, these redemptive aspirations clashed, however, with wartime promises that the British had made with respect to the Middle East. Indeed, British military success in the region was partly the result of really astute, really shrewd diplomacy on the fly. They had more or less obtained a free hand in the region by promising regional stakeholders different things. So they promised the Egyptians post-war independence in exchange for being cooperative during the war. In the Mesopotamia campaign, they posed as liberators, securing the cooperation of the local Arab population against the Ottomans by promising them post-war independence. They promised the Sharifians, the leaders of the Arab revolt, an independent Arab kingdom that would stretch from the Arabian Peninsula to Damascus, and that would include Palestine. But they also promised their European allies, the Russians and the French, that they would divide the spoils of the Ottoman lands with them. This was the infamous Sykes-Picot Treaty. Now, this treaty stipulated that Palestine would be an international territory. Now, the Russians exposed the secret treaty when they left the war after the revolution in 1917. And then with the Russians out of the war and the U.S. only slowly committing to the war, the British make another promise. This time it's the Balfour Declaration, where they promised the Zionist movement a homeland for Jews in Palestine. And they did this out of a quite anti-Semitic assumption that Jews controlled American government and public opinion. And so by making this promise, they would rally American opinion to the Allied cause and undermine the German war effort by winning over the support of German Jews. So Palestine emerges from the war as a thrice promised land, okay? So that the British thought Palestine and other parts of the Middle East were things that they could promise to this or that group without consulting the indigenous population was an assumption of imperial prerogative. This mess of mutually contradictory promises had to be grappled with at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, which we know sought to arrive at a global settlement to secure the world against war going forward. The war had indeed unsettled many parts of the world, but post-war settlement in a place like France or Britain meant something different from settlement in the Middle East. In Western Europe, the revolutionary threat of the war had been stymied. The goal was now to restore and reset, to go back as much as possible to how things had been, given the losses sustained on all sides. Matters of war guilt and border adjustments, we know now, were provoking in their effects, but their intention was to restore the balance of power that an insurgent Germany had destabilized. If the war had been a war to end all wars, they had to now arrive at a settlement that would forever preclude war. The war had been apocalyptic in scale and effects, and what might redeem all that suffering, it was thought in 1919, was arriving at some kind of end of conflict altogether, an end of the rivalries and the dynamic struggle for dominance that had driven recent history and caused the war in the first place. So settlement implied something static and unchanging. The idea of a League of Nations was critical to that vision. It was supposed to be an instrument of international governance to contain conflict and maintain peace, to prove that the war had ended all war. But in the Middle East, the goal was different. It could not be restoration because the Ottoman Empire was gone. The goal was not to restore, but to create a new order. Now, Arabs had fought hard to do this themselves. The Sharifian prince Faisal, Emir Faisal, who was the military head of the Arab revolt, had actually set up a government, a functioning government in Damascus at the end of the war, even though this contradicted the terms of the Sykes-Picot Treaty. The British just kind of quietly let him do that. Now, Faisal came to Versailles to make his claim, having set up this government. There he is. This is a picture many of you may have seen already. He's at the front, and you can see T.E. Lawrence standing right behind his left shoulder. But it soon became clear that it was not people from the Middle East who were going to make the new Middle Eastern order. That would be decided by the powers that be, by the great powers. Now, the League of Nations in 1920 was planned, of course, at the Paris Peace Conference, and it came to include a system of mandate governance, and we've heard a bit about that already. And this mandate system was supposed to settle the disposition of the Middle East indefinitely. So France got the mandates for Lebanon and Syria, as you can see here, and Britain was awarded the mandates for Palestine and Iraq. Now, this is 1920, and the British now, at this point, let the French push Faisal's government out of Damascus, breaking now their promise to the Sharifians. And in exchange, what the British get is that the French allow them to have a free hand in Mosul. And Mosul is really important to the British because it's known to have untapped oil resources. And just to remind you, Mosul is the top, sort of the Kurdish portion of Iraq in the north. So what was a mandate? This was essentially a reframing of liberal imperialism, that kind of myth that justified imperialism in the modern period, the idea that it's some kind of civilizing mission, right? Conquest in the name of future freedom that is always over the horizon and never quite here, right? So mandate gives this idea a new lease on life. In an increasingly anti-colonial world, European powers couldn't simply annex new territories and call them colonies and protectorates. This is a new international climate. But ideas of civilization, I think, as we've seen in the earlier panels, were still racist enough to justify the same thing under the name mandate. So officially, the British and French would rule in these territories temporarily, sort of in loco parentis, until their Arab subjects showed themselves ready or mature for self-rule. But it was obvious to these Arab subjects that mandate was merely a euphemism, a semantic disguise for colony. They suspected that the British were there for the long haul and would only leave when they were forced out. And they were right, because the British only finally left Iraq with a revolution in 1958, even though Iraq was granted formal or nominal independence in 1932. Moreover, the British mandates were administered from a new Middle East desk that was set up in the colonial office. So there wasn't even an attempt to hide the reality there. So why did the British want to hold on to these territories so badly? Are they just compulsive imperialists? From the British point of view, the stakes for controlling the Middle East were high. There were, of course, those hopes for cultural and economic redemption of the war's losses that I already spoke of. And then there were security concerns, long-standing security concerns about the sea and land routes to India and the rest of Asia and the South Pacific. So this is a much older map, and I'm putting it here just to give you a sense of just how old the concern with the route to India was, and sort of a central principle guiding foreign policy from the 19th century. So here's British India, here's Britain. This was all Ottoman territory. The Suez Canal is here. That's the main sea route, but then you have this backup land route, right? And they've always been concerned about that. They're also now concerned about the oil resources in Mosul, and added to the land and sea route, there's also a new air route that goes right through the Middle East, and that's a very important security concern. So as I said, a long alliance with the Ottoman Empire had secured these ends informally before the war. But now, especially with the added importance of oil and air power, it was even more urgent to the British that they have sway in the region, right? Moreover, the region now seemed even more liable to instability and insecurity because of the rise of anti-colonial, communist, pan-Islamic, pan-Arab, and nationalist sentiment, and the revolutionary Russian activity that was going on from everywhere between Turkey to Southeast Asia. The British could not see that their own intrusive presence in the region was the main provocation for a lot of this activity and a major source of the insecurity that they're trying to tamp down on. Now, another factor here is the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union. These are two big continental superpowers. And that their presence, their rivalry, in effect, makes it difficult for the British to adopt an attitude of renunciation towards imperial aggrandizement. They want desperately to preserve their old geopolitical dominance and prestige, and they need more territory. They need that kind of a continental presence in order to compete, especially since they've emerged victors in the war, right? Now, these were the actual stakes from the British point of view, but they were greatly inflated by a paranoid British mindset, which saw these threats in apocalyptic terms. Certainly, there were ties between anti-colonial activists in the region, and there were pan-Islamic goals linking many of these activists, but there was nowhere near the vast conspiracy to disrupt British power that many British officials imagined and actively shared with the British public in order to keep it invested in the idea of British occupation in the Middle East. British officials imagined a pan-Islamic combination with the Bolsheviks that would control everything from Constantinople to Afghanistan and, quote, pursue a policy specifically designed to destroy the British position in the Middle East and India. And this is a world now flooded with guns left over from the war. There's lots of arms that they can't quite collect in. There's a lot of concern about arms trafficking. And they're seeing all these various movements throughout Asia and other parts of the empire that are striving for local autonomy. From the British point of view, they're seen all as part of a single Eastern unrest, capital E, capital U, a malicious plot to undermine the British Empire. So in 1920, Winston Churchill, who was then the Secretary for War and Air, is lecturing in London about a, quote, worldwide conspiracy designed to deprive us of our place in the world and rob us of victory. So holding on to the Middle East was supposed to prevent this nightmare scenario from actually unfolding. Now, The mandate assignments did not enable the British to settle this devil's cauldron, that's what Gertrude Bell called it, even in the short run, not even for 6 months. Settlement aside, peace never came to the Middle East. By treating Versailles as the endpoint of the First World War, we tend to obscure the reality that there was a peace conference, but no peace, no real end to the war in an enormous portion of the world. The early secrecy around the Middle East campaigns, that designation as sideshows, has in a sense permanently colored our reflection on the war, despite the later efforts to reverse that notion. The truth is that our narrative of the war is all wrong. And I know this doesn't apply to most of the people in this room, but to the general narrative out there that students consume, for instance, in textbooks. The war did not end in 1919 with the peace conference. Instead, the conference was a pivotal moment in the continuation of a long European imperial effort to settle the Middle East. And the word settle here has multiple connotations, especially when we take into account the settler colonial approach to Palestine in particular. The Paris Conference was only the first in a series of conferences that attempted, futilely, to close the war chapter in the Middle East. So in 1920, a conference at San Remo continued discussions about the mandate system that had begun in Paris. A few months later, as we've heard, the Treaty of Versailles, also in 1920, openly negotiated the partition of the Ottoman Empire, which had begun with the secret Sykes-Picot Treaty, and it laid the groundwork for mandate rule. The Turkish War of Independence began when Kemal Atatürk stripped the Turkish signatories of the Treaty of Versailles of their citizenship, and it would last for 4 years. Elsewhere in the Middle East, despite the formal armistice in 1918, war went on against this backdrop of great power negotiations. Some have actually speak of an Arab Spring of 1919. Far from a year of settlement, it was a year of revolution throughout the region, uprisings triggered by that effort to settle or colonize the Middle East. So Syrians were resisting French rule. Egypt was in rebellion. Here's a picture of some Egyptian women protesting in 1919. While the British were crushing resistance in Egypt, Egyptians in Britain were also being targeted in race riots in English cities. Across the Middle East, thousands took to the streets in protest. Peasants were staging sit-ins, ripping up railroad tracks, occupying buildings. In 1920, Iraqis rebelled against British rule. And there were common slogans and ideas connecting these risings, which extended to Libya and elsewhere. India and Ireland were also in rebellion. And the British were tracing all this activity to the Bolshevik hand, rather than to genuine anti-colonial sentiment. And so they fight back with brutality. In Iraq, in India, in Somaliland, they bomb rebels from the air to put down these rebellions. Against this backdrop, in 1921, Churchill, who's now the colonial secretary, calls another conference. This one's in Cairo to again attempt to settle the situation in the Middle East. And here's a quite famous picture you may have seen of Churchill with Gertrude Bell and T.E. Lawrence in front of the Sphinx during this conference. It was decided to create, at this conference, it was decided to create a monarchy in the Mandate of Iraq under Prince Faisal, and this would be a consolation prize for the Arab kingdom he had been promised and had lost. He had no connection with Iraq whatsoever. The British also determined to draw on wartime lessons in air power to administer Iraq through the Royal Air Force. And the hope was that aerial control would be more discreet and less provoking than troops on the ground and might then temper Iraqi resistance. Northern Iraq, and this is and this is a densely populated area, you can see. So a bomb being dropped, another the next day, and then the result on the ground. So the Cairo conference, so that happened in the 20s, but we're still talking about the Cairo conference where the decision was made to do this. The Cairo conference moved to Jerusalem in its last couple of weeks, and there it was decided that Faisal's brother, Emir Abdullah, would be the ruler of a new territory called Transjordan, which was an area that was sort of right then and there carved out of the Palestine Mandate. So this is a picture of Churchill and his wife here, standing next to, that's Herbert Samuel, and this is Emir Abdullah. So the situation seemed to be in a state of permanent flux, not settled at all. In 1923, a new treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne, which we just heard of, again ended the conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the Allies, marking the establishment of the Republic of Turkey. And what followed was kind of continuingly harrowing displacement of Greek and Turkish minorities in all these years. But at the same time, though this new treaty has been signed, the fate of Mosul, that oil-bearing region, which is claimed both by Turkey and Britain as part of British Iraq, remains contested. That's still not settled. And it was only settled finally in Britain's favor in 1926. So new treaties breathlessly try to catch up with the ever-shifting reality on the ground. In Palestine, cooperation between Jewish settlers and Palestinians remained elusive. And finally, all promises to all communities were swept aside, and Britain took direct control in that mandate rather than ruling indirectly as it did in the other mandates. And they continued to flip-flop, disavowing commitments to Jews and Arabs in turn, contributing to this unsettled state. They also back both sides of the conflict for power, the contest for power in the Arabian Peninsula. So this is the peninsula in the 20s. As I mentioned, Hijaz was the area ruled by the Sharifians, and this is Najd, which was held by the House of Saud, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, and the British back both, as Saud has these expansionist ambitions. And even though the Sharifians had been Britain's allies in the war. In the end, Saud prevails in 1925. At that moment, Syria was in full-blown war against French rule. And Saud's vanguard military forces, who are known as the Ikhwan, they're continually kind of exceeding his control and raiding across the borders into British Iraq and Transjordan. And so the desert borders are neither clear nor settled. They continue to change even before they could ever be drawn. In Iraq, meanwhile, the British are reframing the terms of their relationship over and over again with new treaties over the next few years in a futile attempt to convince Iraqis that they had any substantive freedom. But with British bombardment ongoing, this was a very difficult case to make. Now, these events had ripple effects beyond the Middle East. In India, there was already, of course, common cause against the British and common interest in ideas like pan-Islam. But the destruction of the caliphate through the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish nationalist revolution gave Indian anti-colonialism another impetus. So while the caliphate was threatened in the early 20s, an Indian movement to preserve it emerged that was known as a Khilafat movement, a slightly different pronunciation. And it brought the two major branches of the Indian anti-colonial movement together in an intense bout of activism that lasted till 1924. And this is an image from that time, and you can see what the flag of the Muslim League, which becomes the Pakistan flag, and the flag of the Congress Party, which becomes the Indian flag. And this is a joint movement by both parties to protest the abolition of the caliphate. So this movement gave the Indian anti-colonial movement its own internationalist outlook. These two parties are refusing the kind of paternalistic imperial assurance that the nation state is the only proper end towards which colonialism is taking its subjects, right? They're doing something very creative and very different. Now, David Fromkin wrote a book 3 decades ago. It's become kind of a classic, and the title of it was A Peace to End All Peace, and it was about 1919 in the Middle East. And his point was that 1919 was disordering rather than ordering. Now, our conference is called The Making of a World Order. But the reality is that a world order was not made. The old order had been unmade, and what replaced it was a kind of continual disordering. What were the sources of this continual history-making after the peace conference of 1919 tried so hard to call for an end to history, right? An end to conflict. So some of it had to do with the fact that this was a moment of global reckoning with minority populations. European colonialism had long been justified as a kind of incubator of nation states. That's the liberal empire story. And then Woodrow Wilson, of course, insisted that this war be fought only in the name of self-determination. Now, the League of Nations consolidated the idea of the homogeneous ethno-nation state as a kind of geopolitical norm. And this vision gave increasing purchase to the categories of minority and majority all over the world. The post-war world was supposed to be a settled order of homogeneous nation states participating in an international order. But the Middle East, like Eastern Europe, and frankly most parts of the world, was a space of mixed people. But this chimera of national homogeneity drove efforts to unmix populations in many places. Following the wartime genocidal elimination of Armenians from Turkey, the pattern was officially consolidated by the 1923 exchange of Greek and Turkish minorities under League of Nations auspices in the name of pacification. And this is a slide just giving, you can't absorb the detail of it. The point is to just the overwhelming kind of confusion of this process, right? And the numbers and the number of years over which this is going on. European cultivation of certain minorities in proto-national mandate territories. So for instance, the British cultivation of the Assyrian minority in Iraq was really tragic, right? And made that minority much more vulnerable to attack and elimination and ethnic cleansing. The persistent dynamism of Middle Eastern history was also rooted in the new geopolitical importance of oil. So the British Navy switched from coal to oil just before the war, when Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty. And this is what made control of Mosul so important to the British, something worth fighting for. Indeed, oil was a key reason why the British even stationed troops in the region at all, as I said earlier, to protect the oil resources in the Persian Gulf. Now, the war had triggered the Russian Revolution as well, which was followed by a civil war in which European powers were also involved. And this too made peace elusive in the region. And again, not to absorb the detail, but just to get a note of the title of this map, the ephemeral states of the Russian Civil War. I mean, these things came and disappeared before they could even be registered, right? This is a very much a time of flux. Another factor causing this dynamism was Wahhabism, which was the strand of Islam embraced by the Ikhwan, those vanguard forces of Saud. And their goal was to sort of purify and unify Islam. And as I said, they exceeded Saud's control. And it's important to understand their outlook as a strand of kind of long cultivated anti-colonial thought in the region. Wahhabism first emerged in the 18th century in the context of growing European influence on the Ottoman Empire. But quite apart from the Ikhwan, anti-colonialism in general was perhaps the most significant factor preventing settling of the region. Better put, the colonial provocation was the most significant factor. And I do want to emphasize, and I think the last panel did this too, that Wilsonian rhetoric was not the source of these struggles for freedom. They didn't need Wilson to figure out they wanted freedom, right? Indeed, many people recognize the hypocrisy of Wilsonian rhetoric, given the United States' own imperial activities in this period. And Middle Easterners drew on other intellectual and cultural traditions of thought about self-rule that were both local and trans-regional. Now, the disordering of the Middle East shaped the Middle East, obviously. The struggle there since 1919 has really been to shake off Western power. It's the same story. This was complicated by the fact that Western power tried to disguise itself as much as possible in this region, as with the 1919 introduction of the euphemistic term mandate and the resort to air power as a mechanism of more discreet or covert colonial control. The particular covert form colonialism took there meant that Middle Easterners thereafter could never quite be sure when they had real substantive sovereignty, which locked them into a permanent posture of anti-colonial suspicion and defiance vis-a-vis the West. Rightly so, for in fact, they did not have real sovereignty because from 1919 on, major Western and Soviet geopolitical rivalries arising from the First World War continued to be fought there. The disordering of the Middle East also had enormous impact on European history. The end of the war saw the emergence of mass democracy in Britain. The vote was the reward for service. This mass democracy demanded control of foreign policy to ensure that their government did not land them in such a nightmare ever again. But as this democracy asserted itself, experts turned foreign policy into a terrain of private, almost secret, closeted decision-making away from the check of the democratic gaze, especially in the context of the Middle East. I'll just briefly mention that notions of heroism after the war, especially anchored to the image of Lawrence of Arabia, and post-war spiritualism in Britain were also grounded in visions coming from the Middle East. Renewed investment in the ideas of liberal imperialism also depended on the mandates in the Middle East. and the development of new military tactics, including deception, covert warfare, and aerial war, was rooted in the Middle East campaigns. And those were the tactics that proved central to European methods in the next World War. And then later, European Cold War rivalries also went through the Middle East too. And then there are the ways in which Middle Eastern matters shaped political and cultural movements in South Asia and Africa in ways that also shaped the history of European nations and their empires. So in terms of local European and world historical importance, the Middle East campaigns of the First World War were hardly sideshows, and 1919 was hardly the end of the war. So just to summarize, I'm going to do something that I hate. I'm going to give you a list of bullet points just for the sake of just showing you how long it is. If we put the Middle East at the center rather than the periphery of European history, leaving aside even its centrality to regional and world history, a few things start to make a lot more sense. Number one, why we think of the Great War at all in global terms as a world war. Number two, why the war lasted as long as it did. British morale depended on good news coming from the Middle East. Number three, why the Versailles Peace Conference was such a momentous event in itself. It was not merely a footnote to the war where it was formally ended, but a productive motor of new history where a knot of conflicts was formed to be plucked apart endlessly in the next years. Or perhaps a better metaphor might be, it was the scene where the dynamite that continues to explode today was laid. Number four, putting the Middle East at the center of this story also shows why the war was so transformative to anti-colonial movements around the world, shaking the foundations of European empires and setting the stage for decolonization. Number five, it shows us why segments, at least, of the British public remained cynical about their government after achieving mass democracy at long last after the war. The war itself had fueled cynicism, but that cynicism became entrenched as the British public rightly suspected that their government was covertly pursuing imperialist ends in the Middle East. Number six, we understand better how Europeans, especially the British, were prepared to fight the next World War, why many Britons especially continue to have faith in war as a productive way to solve conflict, given the kind of rose-tinted perception of its constructive effects in the Middle East that was actively propagandized by their government. It was also in the laboratory of the Middle East, where World War I continued, that the British developed the military techniques, especially air power, that defined the next war. Number seven, we understand better why Russia posed such a threat from the British point of view. It's because the British were so concerned about the Middle East. Number eight, this might be the last one. Yes, this is the last one. Why the League of Nations never really gained credibility, which itself set the stage for further conflict. It was clear to much of the world from the outset that the League of Nations existed to legitimate British and French geopolitical aims, especially in the Middle East. Now, Germany's entry into the League in 1926 seemed momentarily to represent a kind of tectonic shift away from that original focus. But shortly after, the rise of Nazism and Italy's resurgent imperialist ambitions openly rejected the apologetic form of imperialism consecrated by the League. So to conclude, it's a convention of European history to recognize that the peace of 1919 set the stage for World War II. Still, for a time, there was at least a temporary semblance of peace in Europe. In the Middle East, however, the conference of 1919 did not create even the illusion of peace. Rather, it set in motion a dynamic of colonialism and anti-colonialism that made peace permanently elusive right through to our time. Taking a broad and long view, this may perhaps have been the most important in the sense of the most lasting consequence of the 1919 effort to secure peace. It continues to frame our world. We know the war on terror has no end in sight, but it also has no beginning insofar as it is continuous with the aftermath of World War I. The imperious attempt to impose a new order on the Middle East in an age of intensifying anti-colonialism produced perpetual crisis rather than the desired settlement of great power interests. Putting the Middle East at the center of our analysis subverts the very narrative of peace in 1919. There, World War I went on as new military tactics and technologies enabled a state of permanent war in the region. Thank you so much for your listening.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk, and it was one thing I'd like to say. Just we just have a few moments for questions, but I think about the way we started the conference with Philip Zeliko's analysis of the peace that never happened in 1916 that forces us to rethink the sort of leading up to it and decentering the 1919 moment. And now we end, if we put, it's a brilliant move to say, well, actually, we don't have to. We can obviously look at various parts of the world from their own perspective, which we are trying to do this afternoon. But we can also understand and take seriously some of Europe's claims, and then recognize the way that the Middle East is a part of European history and what that forces us to do. And what we see is that the peace never ended. So we had the peace that never happened and the peace that never came, in one sense. So we have time. I suggest we take 3 questions in a row, and then if you'll answer, and then we'll see how much time we have. So why don't we begin here?
I guess, with all the talk of self-determination, why did the Kurds not get their own country?
I can scream. Oh, thanks. So with hindsight, would it have been possible to have come up with a treaty that would have prevented all of the problems in the Middle East?
Should I just say yes?
My question is really a corollary to Mr. Hubbard's question. So you've told a magnificent story of British-led disorder. Quite right. So the alternative to British-led disorder is the British stay out, the Europeans stay out, and you have the unconstrained ethno-nationalist disorder story, where they sort things out for themselves, like was happening in the broken up Russian Empire, killing about 5 million people in the process, like happens in Anatolia, killing another 1 million or 2 people in that process. And you have a prolonged ethno-nationalist disorder between all the various Arab factions and other factions you've described that goes on for some years, killing some number of people. So you're choosing between this terrible story of British-led disorder you've described, or some alternative unknown story of disorder that is not described, and which is not considered. The other aspect of your presentation that bothered me a little bit is if the British aren't there, their nightmare does come true in 1940 and 41. When there's a squadron of Luftwaffe aircraft in Iraq in the spring of 1941. And in 1942, the Germans have an Einsatzgruppe attached to the Afrika Korps to kill all the Jews of Palestine once they get there. So then work the scenario where the British haven't gone into the Middle East. Yeah, the Middle East might look very different today indeed.
Yeah. Yeah, the question about the Kurds. No one in the Middle East got self-determination did not happen for people in the Middle East, right? No one got what they were promised. No community got that. But the Kurds in particular were thrown under the bus because the British, if they wanted anything in the territory that became Iraq, it was the Kurdish territory in Mosul, which is where the oil was. It's quite a cynical story, I think. That's what I would answer to that. The question, was there a possible treaty that could have settled the Middle East properly? I think that's what the complaint was about, people on the left in Britain and then anti-colonial activists everywhere, is that why was this being settled by treaty? When it had been settled on the ground politically and militarily, why did that not count? Why does the settlement have to be in these corridors of European power away from the check of public opinion? So I think anything that was being settled by elites, in an aloof setting, was not going to was going to look like a deal, like some kind of compact among elites, rather than something that was worked out by people and actually giving some kind of recognizing people's right to self-determination. So I think, I can't imagine a perfect treaty that would settle any, one treaty that could finally settle things like that. I don't think that kind of a thing really exists. I mean, if you think about a lot of the, I can't think of a treaty that kind of once and for all settled some problem like that. So, but I think we tend to think treaties should do that, despite the evidence of history. The counterfactual. I have to disagree with you. I don't think that it's true that the counterfactual would be some other equally horrific disorder. So if you just take the case of the Assyrians in Iraq, they would have fared much, much better in Iraq if they had not been cultivated by the British to serve in the levy forces in support of the Air Force. So that compromised them terribly vis-a-vis the rest of the Iraqi population who saw them as collaborators. So without that framework of colonialism, I think there would have been more viability for perhaps for survival, certainly of that minority, and also in other areas. I don't think, for instance, in the Arab kingdom that Faisal was setting up and had set up a government for in Damascus, that didn't have a really strong ethno-national program. That whole Levant area is incredibly mixed in terms of religion and ethnicity, and there was no sort of ethnic cleansing drive there. So I don't think you can assume that the counterfactual would have been something equally horrific. I think it's really important not to underestimate the way a colonial framing, especially at this time in history when there had been such a long anti-colonial struggle already, how much that framing shaped the way people acted, the way people responded to everything that happened after that. And, as for, what happens in Iraq, the nightmare scenario being fulfilled in 1940, again, that is something that's an outcome of the fact that the British are still there. If the British were not in there, why the Iraqis wouldn't have such a motivation to start getting with the Germans? Do you see what I mean? Right? You've got to keep that framework in mind and see these movements and these choices that people are making from that perspective. Even in India, people are, nationalists are going and talking to the Japanese and the Germans. They'll try anything at that moment, any opportunity, because they want to get rid of the frame. Okay? Thank you so much.